Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Self Ruled Podcast. I am your host, Hannah Holden, and we are back for week 9. Week 9 already. So time is flying, but I'm excited to be here this week with you to talk about how your stories really shape and reveal your reality in life. So, what if I told you that the way you see your life isn't just reality, it's a story that you've been telling yourself? I'll say this one more time. What if I told you that the way you see your life isn't just reality, it's a story you've been telling yourself? Let me explain what I mean by a story. A story is the meaning we attach to events, our circumstances, and even ourselves. For example, let's say that you get laid off from work. The fact is, your boss calls you into her office and she lays you off. She may give you a reason or not, but you interpret what happens and you tell yourself a story. So it's the meaning that you attach to events, circumstances, or yourself. So you may attach meaning to the events. You may tell yourself that you were laid off because your boss doesn't value you. You may tell yourself that you were laid off because the company isn't doing well, or you were laid off because it was the universe's way of freeing you from that job so that you can pursue your true purpose and calling. So you tell the story of the facts, and sometimes we tell positive stories, sometimes we tell negative stories, but we're always creating a narrative around our experiences in life. And the reason this matters is because the story that you tell about these circumstances, it shapes your decisions, it shapes your emotions, and it shapes your future, oftentimes without you even realizing that it's happening. So let's take that example I just gave of you tell yourself a story that you were laid off because you're not valued or you're not competent at work. Think about how telling yourself a story like that might affect the way that you feel emotionally, how it might affect the future decisions you make. Maybe you decide that because of that story, you're never going to take a risk again. So this is why these stories are so powerful, is because what we're telling ourselves truly has the power to impact the trajectory of our lives. And I mentioned that a lot of times this is happening on an unconscious level where we're not even aware of the stories that we're telling because maybe you never even thought about it. Maybe you just took that story as fact. And that's what we often do. We think that the story we're telling ourselves is actually the facts because we haven't taken a moment to separate them. And this makes me think of a quote that I really love by Carl Jung, which is, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." I think this quote perfectly aligns with the message that I have today, because a lot of times these stories, these thoughts, this self-talk is happening so unconsciously that we don't realize that it's directing our life, it's directing how we feel, it's directing our decisions, it's directing what we think we are capable of. And as a result, our life is shaped by that, and we may mistake it for fate, as Carl Jung says. But really, when we make those things conscious, that is where we realize we truly have power to shape our future. So going a little bit deeper into what a story is, I mentioned earlier that there is a difference between our facts and then the story we tell ourselves about those facts. So the facts are neutral, and it is our interpretation of the facts that creates the story. Let's talk about an example here. So let's say that you live in the suburbs, you live in a cul-de-sac, and your neighbor Frank runs a stop sign and hits someone. Those are the facts. But you could go to your different neighbors and ask them what happened, and they may have a very different version of those facts, because we often interpret the facts based on our past experiences, our values, and our beliefs. You may go to one neighbor and they may say, well, Frank is always on his phone. I always see Frank texting and driving. So I'm sure Frank was on his phone, distracted, ran that stop sign. I'm sure that's what happened. You could go to another neighbor and they may say, well, it was snowing that day. And I remember how slick the roads get when they're icy. And that's probably what caused this accident, right? So people will add on their interpretation based on their values, their beliefs, their experiences. And that is how things get shaped beyond the facts. Another example, think about a lawyer. A lawyer's job is to take the facts of a case, but then their job is to interpret the facts and present a story, present a case. So if that lawyer is your defense attorney, they are supposed to be on your side. So they are taking the facts and they are creating a narrative around those facts to explain to the audience or to explain to the jury what happened, help them make sense of it. If that lawyer is a prosecutor, they are taking those same facts and they are presenting them in a way, creating a story that paints you as guilty. So we do the same thing in our own lives. We take the facts and we paint a picture with those facts in a certain direction. And this is where I would ask you to think about, what are some of the stories that you're creating from the facts? Are you arguing for lack, limitation? Are you arguing for what's not possible, your faults, your flaws, catastrophes, everything that could go wrong? Or are you the defense attorney and are you arguing for what good is in you, what positive traits and qualities you have, what amazing potential you have, what could go right in this situation? Which way do you tend to go? Are you arguing for the positive or are you arguing for the negative? Because like I was explaining with this lawyer analogy, the facts can tell a different story. We can take the facts and tell different stories with them. And so what are the stories that you are frequently telling about yourself, about your experiences in life, your relationships, things that are happening to you? I do want to touch on the practical reason of why we tell stories. So it's a very practical reason, and that's that we tell stories about facts to make sense of our reality. Stories help us make sense of what we're experiencing in life. They also help us determine if we are safe, if we're valued, if we're capable, if we're okay. So that's why we tell stories. But our stories, as you can imagine, based on what I've shared so far, they can often hold us back. So if we are telling negative stories in our life, they really can keep us stuck. Back to that whole quote from Jung about, we take our experiences as fate based on those unconscious, that unconscious information. So they can really keep us stuck if we're not making those stories, those thoughts, those beliefs conscious. So this is where I would ask you to think about, what are some of those stories that you have in your life? And I'm going to share some examples because I think these are some common ones that I've either experienced or I've heard from other people, but there's some different categories. So for example, money and finances. You may have stories around, I'll never have enough. I can't make more than X dollars a year. I'm bad with money. I'll never be paid enough. I'll never be valued, whatever the money and finances are. I'll never get ahead. I'll always be living paycheck to paycheck. Those could all be potentially negative stories. Maybe you have stories around your health and wellness. So I'm too busy to eat healthy. I don't want to become one of those people that's obsessed with fitness. I don't want to change my lifestyle and habits because I won't be able to hang out with the people I hang out with anymore. So we have a lot of stories. And again, there could be some facts, but how are we taking those facts and weaving them into a narrative that either keeps us stuck or moves us forward? Thinking about your family and relationships, are there stories that you tell there? Maybe you have a story that you're not as successful as your sibling, that your parents don't see you the way that they do one of your siblings. Maybe it's that your family doesn't understand you. It could be about your romantic relationships. Maybe it's some stories you're telling in your workplace related to your career. Maybe you have a story that your boss doesn't appreciate you, or your coworker, they're holding you back. Maybe you have negative stories around your self-image. Maybe you hold some beliefs that you're not attractive, smart, or successful enough. We all have these stories, and this is where I'd really encourage you to just reflect and think about, what are the dominant stories in your life, and how do these stories make you feel? One thing I want to say here is that the stories are really important because, like I said, they can direct your future. But what's probably even more important is the emotions you feel when you tell those stories. So a lot of times the way this works is we see, hear, or observe something. Could be in ourselves, in our life, our circumstances. And then we interpret it. We have to make sense of it. So we tell ourselves a story about that. But the next step in the process is that we add emotion onto it. And that emotion is very powerful, because the stronger the emotion we have about that story, the stronger that story is in our life, the more momentum it has, positive or negative. So if we attach a lot of negative emotion to a certain story, that story is really going to weigh us down and hold us back. On the flip side, if we are telling a positive story and we feel a lot of positive emotion, we generate a lot of positive emotion, then it has the power to give us a lot of momentum in a very positive direction. So that is kind of how we can be aware of the emotions behind the stories we feel. So looking at what are the dominant stories that you tell about your life, but then how do those stories make you feel? Because the reality is that if you are telling a story, whether it be to yourself, maybe what you're telling yourself about a situation, or maybe you're going to other people and telling those people a story about your life, if the story you're telling doesn't feel good, you don't have to tell it anymore. Either decide that you're going to tell a different story, or if you need to, maybe just be quiet. When you catch yourself wanting to tell a story that doesn't make you feel good, you have the power to just stop yourself and say, you know what, that's not the story that I want to tell about this anymore. I've noticed that a lot of these kind of dominant stories in our life, you can kind of cut them into certain categories. I'm sure there's plenty more categories. So if you think of any, let me know. But I in my own life can kind of take some of the stories that I might be telling and put them into some common categories. One of them being stories around lack. So we may have stories of lack in our life, looking at, I don't have enough. This could be of anything. I don't have enough resources. I don't have enough money. I don't have enough food. I don't have enough love. I don't have enough respect. I don't have enough value. Whatever we're perceiving as not having enough, or perceiving a deficit emotionally, financially, whatever it is. And so we are telling ourselves a story that reinforces this idea that we are lacking, something is scarce, we don't have enough. Another category I've noticed of stories is blame stories. A lot of times we tell ourselves stories to assign blame. Either we want to tell ourselves a story that puts the blame on someone else, making them the villain in our story, or we want to tell a story that makes us innocent. So we want to be the victim maybe in the story. We want to avoid responsibility or blame in a situation. So we will tell stories to make sense of these situations, but a lot of times they are skewed in a certain direction that either paints other people as the one to blame or alleviates our responsibility. Maybe if you are very self-aware, or maybe self-aware is not the right word. If you're very sensitive to other people, you may be taking on too much blame. That's possible. Maybe you have a negative blame story where you're constantly blaming yourself for things. So these can go in different directions. Maybe you're making yourself the villain. If you're someone who does that, you're telling yourself a story that it was your fault. Another category of stories I would talk about is fear. So we may be telling ourselves very fearful stories, kind of what's the worst thing that could happen. We're imagining worst case scenario. Things could go wrong, things could fall apart, the worst could happen. So we're looking at circumstances, we're looking at our life and imagining worst case scenario, letting the fear of what could happen get the best of us. We might be telling stories around limitations. So this is another category. Limitations, really looking to highlight where we're limited in some way. And this is similar kind of to, being the victim, but really looking for stories to highlight how we're limited. We can't. We're not capable. We don't have what we need. So those are some of the categories that I've identified. I'm sure there's plenty more, but I think a lot of stories will kind of fit into some of those common categories. So I want to talk about what it would take to really rewrite these stories, because some of these stories can become very powerful. One thing I'll tell you about stories is that the more you tell a story, the more powerful it gets. And so this is where you want to be really careful, because if there's a negative story, in a story that makes you feel like crap, but you've told it a bunch of times to yourself or to other people, that story has become very strong. So the more you feed that story, the stronger it becomes. I'll give you an example to think about. Another way of thinking about this is, I don't know if you've ever driven down a muddy road. I know I have. The way that I grew up, I spent plenty of time driving down muddy roads, whether it be in a vehicle or an ATV. And a lot of times what happens on a really muddy road is that there can become dominant tracks. The more you drive down that road, the deeper the tracks get. So think about your story. The more you tell a story, the deeper the tracks get. And this is really tied to the neural pathways in your brain, because the more you tell your story, the more it reinforces. So the more you drive down those common tracks, the deeper the tracks get. And the deeper that the tracks get, the harder it is to get out of the tracks. So you try to go down the road, you try to go a little bit differently, but it's very easy to slip into those existing tracks because they're so deep. Your stories are the same way. Let's say you've been telling a story about your mother-in-law 100 times to anyone who will listen, and you have made her out to be the villain in your story. You are the victim in that story. You will tell anyone who will listen the situation, so that you're trying to make yourself feel better. But you've told that story so many times that track is deep, deep, deep. And you may realize that this story isn't serving you, that it's not making you feel good about yourself, your relationship, your situation. And so you decide to try to create that new track next time. But like I said, it's going to be really easy to slip into what is familiar because it's deep. So it will take repetition to lay those new tracks. You will have to come up with a new story to tell, and tell that one over and over again until that becomes the new dominant story for that situation. So when you want to rewrite your story, it could take time and it can take repetition. So something to think about when it comes to rewriting your stories is to really look at what are some of the patterns that are emerging in your stories. So really looking at what are some of the repetitive narratives. Is there a story that you're telling all the time? Is there a certain trend with your stories? Are they all stories about lack? Are they all stories about you being the victim? What are you noticing about your stories? What repeats itself? Something else you can think about is, what is the next chapter? So maybe in your current chapter, you've been telling these same stories over and over and over again about your life. And I think sometimes we have this tendency to think that our current chapter is the final chapter. So we look at things in extremes and absolutes that, okay, what I'm experiencing in my life right now, this is how it will always be. This is how I will always be. This is how these other actors or characters will always be. And we have this very final view. But what if the chapter you're on is not the end of the book? What would you want your next chapter to be? I think that one's powerful. So really thinking about, what if your story didn't end here? What would you want to do next? What is the next chapter? And then another question you can think about is, how can you be the author in your story? A lot of times we're giving our power away because we see ourselves as these passive characters in the story of life. We're just doing what we're told. We're just playing along. We're just following along. We believe we've been given our role, we've been given our lines, we've been given a character, and we see ourselves as the actor who's just taking cues from some director, and we're externalizing our power. We're giving our power away. But where you can really begin to make change in your life is when you realize that you are the author of your story. If you don't like the story you're living, if you don't like the character that's been written, you are the main character of your life, but you are also the author of your story. So you have the power to write a different story. You don't like the way your character is living, write new lines for your character. So really thinking about, how can you become the author of your own life? Really shift from being that passive character to an active, conscious creator of your life. I do want to share maybe one of the biggest stories that I've transformed in my life. I mean, there have been many, there will be many. We're always evolving and growing and learning. One of the stories that I really changed in my life was a story from feeling like I was lost and I didn't know who I was and I didn't know what I wanted, to realizing that I could create and know all of those things. When I first got out of the Marine Corps in 2010, I spent years feeling lost. So my story was that I'm lost. I don't know what I want. I don't know what my purpose is. And it was even some thoughts around, what is wrong with me? Why is this happening to me? I was in this state of feeling lost, feeling confused, not feeling very valuable because I didn't have clarity on my purpose or the direction I wanted to go in life. And I actually felt a tremendous loss of value when I got out of the Marine Corps, because I had come from a place where people needed me. I felt important. I felt valuable, to then becoming a full-time adult college student where I question all of those things. So that was the story. Those were some of the stories that I was living. I'm lost. I don't know what I want. And I had to change those stories by changing the way that I was talking to myself and change the questions that I was asking myself. So instead of asking myself questions like, what is wrong with me? Why is this happening to me? Beginning to ask more positive, future-oriented questions. So when I think about past, and a lot of times people want to ask why questions, like, why do I do this? Why is this happening to me? What's wrong with me? And it's kind of a dead end. I think some of those questions can be good for therapy, but as a life coach, I'm all about future. So not getting too stuck on, why am I like this? Instead, you want to ask empowering questions. What do I want? What direction do I think I want my life to go? Who do I want to become? What is going well in my life? What evidence do I have that I'm not lost? So really flipping the script on not asking all of the negative questions all the time, but what are positive questions? That's another way that you can begin to transform some of those negative dominant stories in your life. So that is one of the biggest narrative changes that I've gone through in my life, but there have definitely been many others. So as we come to a close here, I want to ask you, what's one story you've been telling yourself that's holding you back? And how would your life change if you rewrote it? So if you're feeling stuck with a story in your life right now, I would definitely encourage you to journal about this and answer that question. You can always come back and listen to this again or pause it, but journal about, what is that one story you've been telling yourself that's holding you back right now? So you could write that story out, write a paragraph, write a page, whatever. What's the story that's holding you back? And then do the same thing, but write the story that you want to be living. So write another paragraph or page or whatever on what is the story you want to be living. So I hope that this week was helpful for somebody. It's been a pleasure to be back here another week on the Self-Ruled podcast, where we are really showing up as our true selves. We are being unapologetic. We are making our own rules in life. We are claiming our purpose to become who we are meant to be. I'll see you next week.